Afternoon, everybody. You're in the Milano room under the Web Apps track. This is Chris Ang and Brandon Creighton giving a presentation on deconstructing ColdFusion. Please give them a good hand.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. We'll be talking about ColdFusion today. Just quick show of hands. Who here has done any development or pen testing or code review of a ColdFusion application? Okay, good. We can dispense with some of the background information probably. Just at a high level, this talk is really not to bash Adobe. There's no 0 days. There's no really flashy substance here about vulnerabilities in the platform itself. What we're really trying to do is provide a practical talk that gives you information that you can go back and use in your jobs, whether you're a developer or a code reviewer or a pen tester, things that you can actually go back and look for or do to improve the security of your applications. We'll also provide some background about how ColdFusion actually works underneath the covers, what the underlying Java classes look like, and some of the request processing, variable scoping, and a lot of the information about just how ColdFusion works underneath the ColdFusion markup layer. Very quickly, our bios. My name is Chris Ang. I'm the Senior Director of Research at Veracode. Veracode is a software security analysis company. We do software analysis in the cloud, and my job at Veracode is to run the team that defines all the requirements and information for how we look for vulnerabilities in different languages and different frameworks and so on. And I'm here with Brandon Creighton, who's one of the researchers on my team, who's done a lot of the ColdFusion work and various other platforms. Our agenda today is we're going to start out by talking about the platform. What's the background of ColdFusion? Where did it come from? How has it evolved over the years? It's actually a very old development platform with a lot of history and several companies behind it. We'll then go into the platform architecture and talk about the ColdFusion markup language a little bit and describe how ColdFusion pages are processed and the different parts of a ColdFusion page and components and the building blocks, basically. And then we'll have a section covering a bunch of different practical tips for practitioners and developers, which is the at home or in your jobs. And then finally, at the end of the talk, we'll be doing ColdFusion Behind the Curtain, which gets into what does ColdFusion look like when it's compiled down to Java. And we'll look at some of the ugliness that happens when you do that and what the resulting classes look like when you compile it down. And then we'll also have a little tool to provide at the end of it, which will help reverse engineers ColdFusion applications. Okay, so the background. Well, like I said, this is a really old platform. ColdFusion was originally developed in 1995 by a company called Alaire in Massachusetts. And if you think back to 1995, there really was not a whole lot of web application going on at the time. Most websites at the time were static. They were HTML. There were maybe some CGI scripts or very small Perl scripts or things that did simple tasks, but not full-fledged web applications. So the idea at the time was make it easier for people who are writing HTML to do real things with their websites. And the first thing that they wanted to enable was connecting simple HTML pages to a database. But they didn't want to do it in such a way that required somebody with programming expertise to build these applications. So they designed something that looks like HTML, but had some additional tags that would enable this functionality. And that way you could take these web designers or people that could just code up basic HTML without necessarily having any programming background, and they could start to write web applications that did things. So from the very beginning, it's designed for an audience that is not developers, and that's a theme that will play out, more and more as we get into the different topics that we'll cover later. Initially, when it was released in version 1.0, it was Windows only. It had its built-in web server. It was a custom web server, and it was very simple. It didn't do very much. Fast forward 7 years to ColdFusion 6 in 2002, and what they did here is they transitioned from a custom web server and custom everything to J2EE. So J2EE was becoming popular around this time, and they said, well, let's make ColdFusion J2EE compliant, and that way you could write an application and you could deploy it anywhere, whether it's WebLogic or WebSphere or ATG Dynamo at the time, or whatever the J2EE server was, and so it makes it a little bit more portable to different servers. So with ColdFusion 6, everything got compiled to Java classes before it was run. Apps could be bundled up as wars or ears, just like any other J2EE application. You could bundle up the admin interface and other pieces that come with the ColdFusion runtime. And ColdFusion 6 was bundled with JRun, which was the J2EE server that Alaire, actually it was Macromedia by this time, that they had also purchased through a different acquisition. So they were kind of bundling all these products together. And now if you fast forward another 7 years, ColdFusion 9, which is the latest version, was released in 2009. Of course, it's Adobe now, and the recent versions since ColdFusion 6 have focused mostly on integration with other Adobe technologies and some other Microsoft technologies, but basically interoperability layers to make it just more powerful and you make it able to connect with other pieces of the infrastructure. Historical vulnerabilities, we won't spend a whole lot of time here, but just to give you a big picture of what ColdFusion has faced in the past. Just about every type of vulnerability has been found over the years in ColdFusion. I mean, it's 15 years old. It's had plenty of time to get attacked. In the earlier versions, prior to ColdFusion 6, when it was the Alaire Macromedia days, you had arbitrary file retrieval. There was some pretty ugly stuff with XOR encrypting passwords. Every J2EE server pretty much had predictable session identifiers, and ColdFusion was no exception to that. And there have been recent vulnerabilities as well. Within the past 12 months, just if you go and search the National Vulnerability Database, you can find ColdFusion vulnerabilities. Most of them are cross-site scripting vulnerabilities these days. And I found a couple that were filed in May 2010. So this is still something that's being actively attacked, and people are still finding issues in this platform. This is a question that I get quite a bit when I mention to somebody that I'm talking about ColdFusion. And I say, well, does anybody actually use that anymore? And that was a good question because these days, if you're developing a new application, especially if you're in an enterprise, you're probably picking J2EE, you're picking ASP.NET. Those are the most popular platforms today. But if you just go and search Google for file extensions to give you kind of a rough cut of who's using ColdFusion, you can see that the numbers are still relatively high. ASPX would be an ASP.NET page, and we found 1.2 billion of those, and we found roughly a third of that number of ColdFusion pages. So it's still fairly prevalent. Now, it's not anywhere nearly as prevalent as PHP pages, obviously looking at the numbers there, but you can see it's still there. It's still in the top 4 or 5. And this Google search was done a couple months ago, but I doubt it's changed too much in that time. If you look at Adobe's website, they cite that there are 770,000 ColdFusion developers, 12,000 companies, and 125,000 ColdFusion servers. And I just picked some of the logos of the companies that were listed on there just to kind of give you a feel for, these are some pretty big companies using ColdFusion still today for some of their marquee applications. And then this is a graph that came from a recent report from White Hat that one of their security statistics reports that they release every quarter. And they release this chart that shows how different verticals use different web application platforms. So the boxes in gray that I have outlined in orange are the ColdFusion chunks. And you can see that the ColdFusion is most prevalent in education, healthcare, and retail, according to White Hat. Anecdotally, we know that ColdFusion is also very popular in the government space. And I asked Whitehead about this, why isn't government represented here? They actually had said they took some of that data out because for probably some contractual reasons, but they explicitly took out the government data, so that's why it's not reflected here. If it were here, I expect it would probably be somewhere between 20 and 30% as well, just based on what we've seen in the field. And then finally, before we start to get into the building blocks of ColdFusion, why did we do this talk? We were developing ColdFusion support for our binary analysis service at the request of some customers. So we had to go through our process of figuring out how ColdFusion works, looking at the attack surface, figuring out what common coding patterns people would do that would create the typical types of web application vulnerabilities. So we had to do this research in order to get our product to support ColdFusion analysis. And as we were doing that, as we were looking in the literature to figure out how these things worked, we found that there were not really that many resources available on securing ColdFusion apps or testing ColdFusion apps. There were little islands of information here and there. Adobe had several documents that covered ColdFusion. One was specifically dedicated to security. It was a ColdFusion 8 security guidelines. But when we looked at it, it was mostly information on security features, authentication, kind of best practices, and here's how to use these different features, but very little information on common mistakes that people make or pitfalls to watch out for, or comparisons between coding good code and bad code. Similarly, there's a securing applications section in the ColdFusion 9 developer guide, which is over 1,000 pages, but it's about the same information. There was an OWASP project started for ColdFusion in May 2009, and it had a few check-ins, and then it got abandoned. So there wasn't really anything to take from there. And then every other presentation we've seen in security conferences or other places that covered ColdFusion security, we're looking at the infrastructure footprint, specifically which ports are open, how do I minimize the attack surface of ColdFusion, but not a whole lot of information on the applications themselves, right? So it was like, well, you can attack the admin server this way, or you can attack the RDS server, or different components that get shipped with ColdFusion, but they wouldn't talk very much at the code level. So that's what we saw out there, and so that's why we felt the need to put together this talk. So Brandon's going to go over the basics of platform architecture, and then we'll get into the code samples.
So a lot of you, we did a show of hands earlier, a lot of you know a lot of this, so I'll skip through it pretty quickly. But ColdFusion is mostly comprised of pages and components. Both of these are HTML-styled markup files. They're similar to, it's similar to traditional ASP and PHP and syntax, sort of, except that it's a little bit, they tried to make, in the earlier stages of ColdFusion, they tried to make as much as possible done using HTML-style tags. So if you want to open a file and read lines from it and output them from that, there's a tag to open the file, there's a tag to loop it over, and there's a tag, there's a way to interpolate that data into your output. The difference between pages and components is that pages are usually the main entry points. They end in CFM, and they basically just they are interpreted, except for the ColdFusion specific tags, they're just output directly out to the response. And the ColdFusion tags are evaluated, and that's how it works. Components usually contain usable functions that other people can incorporate into it, and you can call component functions from other pages or other components. And it's basically just a way to reuse code through an application. Functions, or AKA UDFs, user-defined functions, it's a traditional function. You can call them remotely. One interesting thing about these about functions is that as of, I don't know when it started. I think it was around CF6 or CF7. Functions, they allow the ability for functions to be called externally if there's an access modifier